Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Before we get into today's topic, I want to say a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning platform that hosts thousands of classes from people willing to share their skills so you can develop yours. There are so many classes to choose from, you are sure to find something to take your fancy. This month, I've been getting a lot out of the self-care course from the utterly delightful Jonathan Van Ness, which is, full disclosure, serving two ends. Firstly, it's helping to remind me to take time for myself. I'm really excited to follow along and create my own self-care planner. And secondly, it's filling my Queer Eye gap as I wait for the next series to drop. Skillshare is a creative and inspiring community. Skillshare is the place to keep you learning. With a Skillshare membership, you can access their ever-growing list of premium classes to explore whenever suits you. There are also live sessions that you can try if you want that real-time learning environment. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today. As with the last time Skillshare sponsored a video on this channel, we are once again going to look at an historical skill that I would say is fortunately now unnecessary. Escaping from imprisonment in the dread fortress of the Tower of London. Will the featured figure in today's video make it out and stay out? I touched on today's story briefly in my video on the history of the Tower of London, which I will be linking. We're looking at the tale of Ranulf Flambard, and when it comes to how history remembers him, his whole life is frequently overlooked in favour of focusing on his 6 months as a prisoner in the Tower of London. His birth is dated to around 1060. His origins and early life are recounted by Odric Vitalis in his Ecclesiastical History, which was completed in 1141. He writes that Ranulf was low-born, the son of an obscure parish priest of the Diocese of Bayeux by the name of Thurston. His mother is said to be a witch or sorceress, who is also described as being alive and by her son's side in 1101. We'll get to that in a bit though. Describing Ranulf, Odric Vitalis states that, quote, having been brought up from his earliest years among the vile parasites of the court, was better skilled in crafty intrigues and verbal subtleties than in sound learning. Inflated with ambition to raise himself above the eminent men who adorned the court of the great King William, he undertook many things without orders, and of which that prince was ignorant, making impertinent and vexatious accusations in the king's court, and arrogantly overawing his superiors as if he was supported by royal authority. In consequence, Robert, the king's steward, gave him the surname of Flambard, which indeed prophetically suited his genius and conduct, for, like a devouring flame, he tormented the people and turned daily chants of the church into lamentations by the new practices he introduced into the country. So, sounds like Ranulf had a great reputation and was super popular in the decades after his death in 1128. Side note, the king's steward, Robert, the one handing out the surnames as dispensator, is apparently where the dispenser family name originates. There will be lots of Hugh dispensers, one of whom became the controversial favourite of King Edward II and who ultimately met a very unpleasant end. But that's a story for another video, if you like. Back to our pal Ranulf. His father's apparent connection to Bayeux could have provided him with the opportunity to come to the attention of Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, who was himself the half-brother of William, Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror. By 1085, Ranulf had entered the chancellery of King William I and was keeper of the royal seal. John Mason offers an additional source suggestion for where Ranulf obtained his surname, explaining that, quote, one chronicler, the annalist of Winchester, calls Flambard Pas Flambert, or more rarely, Pas Flambert. In the Domesday Book itself, he appears under several names, Flambard, Flamme, Flammard, and is recorded as holding 2 churches in Surrey and as possessed of small estates in that and several other counties. Mason explains that the fact his possessions of churches and estates were, quote, worth in all perhaps £30 annually, coupled with the variety of monikers he is known by, quote, suggests that he was not, by 1086, when the Domesday Book was completed, a well-known or prominent royal servant. This runs counter to the understanding of the Domesday Book and its creation by David Roffe, who names Ranulf Flambard as the possible supervisor for the compilation of the Domesday Book, which Roffe claims occurred in 1089, after William I's death in September 1087, all of which represents a radical alternative proposition. During the next reign, that of William the Conqueror's son William Rufus, King William II, Ranulf Flambard certainly enjoyed evident prominence, prestige, wealth, and power. Vacant church lands had come into his custody by 1088. The lands of Canterbury were added to that in 1089. In September 1093, Ranulf, alongside the incumbent Bishop of Winchester, acted as judges at Bury St Edmunds and Norwich. Returning to the work of Mason, he asserts that around this time Ranulf, quote, appears to have been the head of both the clerical and the lay sides of the royal household. Still, his prominence and place of trust with King William II could and would be proven further. During the later 1090s, when William was out of England to tend to affairs in Normandy, the king left Ranulf as one of his regents, according to 3 extant writs from across that period. For King William II, it would seem that Ranulf Flambard performed multiple functions. The sources recount that he acted as a zealous tax collector or exactor, a highly successful legal agent or representative who also worked to develop the legal system. He was a judge, as previously mentioned, and the king's chaplain. It seems clear to me that Ranulf Flambard was a persuasive person. I think he must have been capable of being charming, but perhaps only when and or if he was able to recognise the profit in being so. Ranulf Flambard was his monarch's chief adviser. In the late 1130s, the Anglo-Norman chronicler Geoffrey Gaimar recounts how easily and naturally the king was said to have passed a dispatch about the revolt of Le Mans over to his adviser as soon as it arrived. In 1094, when William II was setting up to make war on his brother in Normandy, Robert Curthose, Ranulf found a way to send his king money for trained mercenaries rather than sending him untrained Englishmen. While the king appears to have been grateful to have him and willing to reward him, it would seem that Ranulf was not universally loved. A host of chroniclers would attack his character and denounce him as an extortionist who impoverished in the name of taxation. William of Malmesbury, writing in the first half of the 12th century, claimed that Ranulf would duplicitously double any tax the king ordered, Ranulf, often gets the credit for William II's one-time writ to the tenants of the vacant see of the Bishop of Worcester in the aftermath of the death of the Bishop Wulstan in 1095 to claim a fee of relief from them for the king. Normally, the monarch would make the claim of the next incumbent to an episcopal or abbatial vacancy. That individual would then reclaim from his new tenants. At the start of 1096, the year after the death of Bishop Wulstan of Worcester, the Bishop of Durham died. His estates and their rents remained in royal custody until May 1099, when Ranulf became the new bishop. He was consecrated in that role the next month, on the 5th of June 1099. However, his state would be altered the very next year by the death of his royal master and protector on the 2nd of August 1100 in arguably suspicious circumstances, as William was shot with an arrow by one of his own men while out hunting with them in the New Forest. Some historians have implicated William's brother and successor as King Henry in orchestrating his brother's demise. The new king was crowned with, frankly, indecent speed as King Henry I just 3 days later, on the 5th of August 1100, and he swiftly set about marking himself and his rule as something wholly distinct from his brother's, especially in its more unpopular excesses. 10 days after his coronation, on the 15th of August 1100, he had Ranulf Flambard arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, in what is now known as the White Tower, which had not long been completed. Ranulf, therefore, has the dubious distinction of being remembered as that dread fortress's first state prisoner. We might assume that Ranulf expected that King Henry I intended to make an example of him. But early the next year, at the start of February 1101, so 6 months after his imprisonment had begun, Ranulf was aided with a rope being smuggled into his prison in a flagon of wine. He was good enough to share the wine with his guards, who became, apparently, inebriated to the point of unconsciousness. At which point, allegedly in the early hours of the morning, Ranulf attached the rope to a pillar divide in one of the windows of the White Tower, which he then used to lower himself to the ground, where friends with waiting horses were ready to help him flee to Normandy. According to Orderic Vitalis, he had forgotten his gloves, and so tore the skin of his hands on the rough rope that it apparently went down to the bone. To me, this is either intended to be a barb at how delicate the skin of his hands were, as a way of intimating that he'd never put them to work, or it's showing how high he was coming from. We have no real other indication of where he was held in the White Tower, on which floor or on which side. Thus, we have no idea where he was supposed to have descended from. Complicating matters further is the fact that the modern Tower of London has a collection of windows that were enlarged in the 18th century. So it's hard to say for certain if or where the windows Ranulf would have known would have been located. How many of them would have been big enough for him to get through? Would any of them have been? Orderic Vitalis even claims that Ranulf wasn't that petite. He tells his readers that as Ranulf's escape rope, quote, did not reach the ground, the portly bishop fell, and being much bruised, groaned piteously. Despite the bruised bottom and the exposed bones in his hands, he was apparently hardy enough to ride on horseback all the way to that waiting ship that had been prepared for his escape. He had had enough time to organise and be able to have his treasure accompany him, including his bishop's staff or crozier. Oh, and he also brought his mother, that alleged sorceress, with him too. Although the keeper of the tower was fined, I would argue that perhaps whatever alleged bribe he was given by his enforced and now escaped guest would have been more than sufficient to cover it. Unless we want to believe the drunk guard's budget Mission Impossible descent version of the escape, that is. If you thought that this brush with incarceration would have taught our tricksy priest a lesson, that he would be happy in his stolen liberty to live out his days in peaceful obscurity, think again. If anything, he just gets more brazen and audacious. Ranulf, deprived of his bishopric at the behest of an enraged English king, cozied up to Henry I's brother Robert, Duke of Normandy, known, as I mentioned previously, as Robert Curthose. Ranulf supported, allegedly instigated, Robert's attempt to invade England in order to dethrone Henry I in 1101. Ranulf even went with Robert on his ultimately failed mission. For some reason, Henry decided to work with Ranulf after this. He even sets about returning the bishopric of Durham to him. We might wonder what Ranulf had promised the king that had imprisoned him, whose attempted deposition he had supported. Perhaps it can be explained simply by looking at what happened next. Before the year was out, Ranulf was back beside Robert in Normandy, allegedly as King Henry's secret agent. Whether he was fulfilling this secret role or not, it doesn't seem to have turned him away from familiar pastimes and behaviours, because he once again sets about organising ecclesiastical appointments in ways that would benefit him and those close to him. He obtained the bishopric of Lisieux for his brother, and then, after that brother's death in January 1102, he scandalously obtained the same see for his own son, Thomas, who was still a boy. To compound this further, Thomas's younger brother was named as his potential successor if the elder boy should die. In the meantime, presumably as they waited for Thomas to grow up and be educated, Ranulf held and administered the see as its guardian. Ranulf made a few trips back to England between 1102 and 1106, which was the year when he returned to take possession of the See of Durham. Although his political capital was not decimated, it was diminished. King Henry I had chosen another churchman to be his chaplain cum leading minister. He was Roger, Bishop of Salisbury. But that doesn't mean that Ranulf didn't keep himself busy. He spent time with the mother of a number of his children and her husband. He is said to have made attempts to seduce at least one other young lady. He also maintained a place at the table of power, even if he was no longer in one of the main seats. He joined Henry in Normandy, which had been taken into his control and away from that of his brother Robert in 1106. Ranulf was present and involved in political and ecclesiastical matters of high importance. As Bishop of Durham, Ranulf funded the building of Durham Cathedral, from funds that were originally intended for the monks. It's probably unsurprising, but the Durham bishopric's income went up with Ranulf at the helm. When looking for new monks and officials, Ranulf relied on his time-honoured practice of nepotism and sourced from within his own family. In the late summer of 1128, Ranulf was nearing 70 years old. For the 2 preceding years, his physical and mental acuity had been fading. But at this time, he had himself brought into his cathedral in order for him to make public restitution for the funds he had diverted away from his colleagues and into the building of that cathedral. He would die on the 5th of September 1128 and would be buried in the chapter house of Durham. It seems that, in spite of everything, Ranulf Flambard was well regarded and fondly remembered by those who wrote of him in Durham. The same cannot be said of Victorian scholarship on him, which regarded Ranulf Flambard, perhaps somewhat reductively, as the feudal system's malignant genius. However, his legacy did come in for reconsideration in the next century, in 1970, when Sir Richard William Southern described him as, quote, the first outstandingly successful administrator in English history. He was also, most likely, the first outstandingly successful escapee from the Tower of London. And however he managed to do that, I believe that we have seen that it's a feat that is nothing to be sniffed at. But what do you think? Do you believe the escape happened in the way reported? What do you think of the parts of Ranulf's life that don't involve the Tower of London? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video, or you can find me on social media. I'll leave links to the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Follow me over on some or all of them so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? Please also let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you think you're subscribed, maybe have a little check now to make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you. While you're there, checking, subscribing, or maybe resubscribing, why not hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you can have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.